This week in the conversation, it's an honor for me to receive author Thomas Oliver Ott. He is a historian and novelist. He's written a historical novel based on the life of a slave by the name Saturday, who lived in the Breda plantation, the same plantation where Toussaint Louverture lived before the Haitian Revolution. So it's an interesting story. But before we get into the video, I just want to remind you, it's important to subscribe to this YouTube channel. And if you do, don't forget to click the notification bell so that way every time a video is posted, it'll go directly into your portable. So let's get started. Again, my name is Ardain Isma, and I'm here with author Thomas Ott from Louisiana. We're going to be talking about his wonderful book titled Saturday and the Rich Woman. But to begin with, I just have to say, Tom, welcome to the conversation.
Glad to be here.
All right, so before we start, but could you please tell the viewers of CSMS Magazine who is Thomas Oliver Ott?
Do what now?
Would you please tell the viewers of CSMS Magazine who is Thomas Oliver Ott?
I will, and I hope you don't get differing opinions.
No.
I'll give you my view.
Okay.
First of all, before saying anything about me, I want to mention that a lot of where I have arrived in life is due to the people in my life.
Okay.
Especially my wonderful wife, who's my technical assistant in trying to write books.
Okay.
And three wonderful children, one of whom has followed in Daddy's footsteps and has become a history professor at Birmingham Southern University.
Okay.
Now, I first saw light, so to speak, in Georgia.
Okay.
But I hardly had my eyes open before my parents moved to upstate South Carolina.
Okay.
And that's where I grew up. And I had a wonderful childhood, but I especially paid attention to Low Country, because Low Country is where most of the Otts, where the Ott ancestors have been buried.
Okay.
And also where most of my extended family still lives.
Okay.
And they're in that little area of land between Charleston and Branchville.
Okay.
Branchville is 70 miles inland from Charleston. And Branchville was where Saturday's story was read by Grandfather Philip to a slave cook and to his wife a long, long time ago, 200 years ago. Anyway, I grew up and would make trips down to Low Country. And then, of course, I went to college and got all the requisite degrees you have to get to become a college professor. I got my PhD at the University of Tennessee in Latin American history.
Okay.
With an emphasis on Haiti.
All right. Okay. And that was going to be my question.
Yes. And what's interesting is my dissertation that I wrote really took off. And my first book that was published, published in 1973.
Okay.
It's this one right here, The Haitian Revolution.
Okay.
1789.
We'll raise it up a little bit so the audience can see it. There you go. We see it. Okay.
And that was 1973. It got very good reviews. One reason I wrote it was one of the authors that I like a great deal and still do is C.L.R. James. And James's Black Jacobins, something of an inspiration. And I felt like it could add something to the story, especially for those who are completely uninformed about the rebellion.
Exactly.
And then many years went by, and I then, of course, taught at the university level for 43 years at the University of North Alabama. Retired in 2010, and then that's when I began to turn back to my writing. I finally had enough time to write.
Now, let me tell you for a second. Is that where you're talking to me now from North Alabama? I just met this. I thought you were in Louisiana.
I figured that out.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. But so anyway, as I said, taught for 43 years, retired, and that gave me a chance to restart a writing career. Okay. I've written a lot of articles about Toussaint Louverture and made even speaking tours about him much earlier. And now I can come back to what I really enjoy doing probably the most, which is to write.
Right, okay.
And so Saturday the Witch Woman was my first one out of the gate.
Okay, now let's get into Saturday now.
Okay.
So it all begins on the night of August 22nd, 1791.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, huge slave rebellions, plantation set ablaze, and then a slave named Saturday, still in the middle of all this, managed to save the lives of 2 white children. Then right. What?
Well, Saturday had come there probably from Breda Plantation, which is where Toussaint was very
right.
much in control.
Right.
And it's also interesting to note that Saturday was well educated. He could speak 7 languages. And that's one reason I could get on his trail a little bit, was because I found a few written accounts and sort of guide wires to his life story. But he came there to Mill Fleur, which was a plantation not far from Breda.
Mm.
And he became grandmother Catherine Chartrand's slave attendant. But they were very, very close because, a lot of becauses, but one reason why she had a very poor marriage, and she saw in Saturday qualities that she wished that her husband had.
Okay.
And so that was, and he was very close to those 2 boys. It's possible that Philip may have been sired by Saturday.
Really?
And so that makes kind of an interesting twist to the story. It's almost impossible to prove up or down, but in his later years, Philip, when he was in Branchville,
right,
in the 1850 census,
right,
listed himself as a mulatto, or person of color.
Really? So now let's stop here for a second, Tom, because if you see him, if he was a mulatto, it must have been what we call a quadroon mulatto person, right? Mm-hmm. So, which might have maybe, can we interpret Saturday might have been some sort of a person of mixed race also? No?
Well, certainly Philip was possibly of a mixed race. That Philip, I think the reason he did that,
right,
there were a lot of reasons. His love for Saturday was one of them.
Oh, okay.
He also had a guilt about owning slaves. And let me tell you, in 1850, if you were a slave owner, you could have the heart of Jesus and you still couldn't set your slaves free. Mm-hmm. It was against the law. Mm-hmm. If you had taken them out of state to set them free, then he would have, everything he had would have been confiscated. He would have gone to jail when he came back.
Right.
So he didn't have, given those restrictions, he didn't have the courage to end his part of the slave experience. But he did have the courage to list himself as a person of color. Now, the reason that's significant is that it was in Orange County, South Carolina. And when they did censuses, they posted the censuses on the courthouse bulletin board.
Okay.
People from Branchville, 10 miles away, would go there and look at the census and say, aha, I didn't know old Sam over there was this, that, or another.
Right, right.
Word would have gotten back. And he was in a very sensitive position because he was station master at the railroad junction there in Branchville. He had a restaurant. And, he was very, I see in him a conflict that good people sometimes have when they know they've taken a wrong step, you agree.
I agree with you. Yeah. And in fact, in his book, He Shall Go Out Free, written by Douglas Egerton, depicting the life of a freed slave named Denmark Vesey, where he recounts the position of the mulatto communities in Charleston in the early 1800s.
Yeah, I would also say that the free black. Now, what's interesting, and I might mention this as a kind of lead up to the Vesey question, is that Saturday came there to Charleston with the two boys. He refused his freedom because the only way he could stay with those boys was as their slave. But he treated them as his children. They regarded him as his father. He disciplined them like any strict father would. And they loved him. But later on, after the boys left the nest and took some wrong steps in life, then Saturday realized that his time was running out to be a free man. And then Denmark Vesey became more and more attractive to him because as they came into South Carolina in 1791, I figured around September 1791 was when Saturday landed there with the boys. There was a whole crowd of Frenchmen who came in, white Frenchmen, and they were patted on the back because at that moment, Charleston was in love with the French Revolution. What they weren't in love with was the Haitian Revolution.
Exactly, that's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah. So anyway, the people like Saturday were called French Negroes. Now, in the black community, they were heroes. In the white community, they were villains. They were people to be wary of. And Saturday was half amused by all of this. I mean, he could see the humor in bad things sometimes. But Vesey attracted him. Now, Vesey, what happened to Vesey in 1799, he won a lottery in South Carolina. And that he bought his freedom with that money from the lottery, but he couldn't buy his family. And that just infuriated him, and I can understand why. But anyway, he had an appeal to what I call the people of color, the free black community, and slaves who should be free, but never be free, like Saturday. So Saturday was drawn into it. He signed Peter Poyas's book of conspirators. And was lured into it by Gullah Jack, who worked with Saturday at a shipyard. And but anyway, he began to have second thoughts about it because he began to realize this was not going to be an uprising to liberate the slaves. In fact, Vesey was going to sacrifice the countrymen. That was the name given to slaves out in the plantations. He was going to turn them loose on Charleston to create bedlam, and in the confusion, he and about 1,000 of his followers were going to take ship for Haiti. But the reason Saturday turned against it was, he said, you know what's going to happen? The very people that are going to help pry him loose and carry out are going to be sacrificed, because you had a Secretary of State and a president who were both slaveholders at the time. He said, you can just imagine what's going to happen if you don't include the slaves. And when he realized that Vesey wasn't going to do that, then he backed out, and of course worried that he was going to lose his life, because Vesey had an explosive temper. And so Saturday went and stayed with Philip, who had a public garden there in Charleston. And the news broke about this thing coming on. What broke was a schooner came into Charleston Harbor from Haiti, flying a Pendant 69, which I thought it was 69, and I contacted the Mystic Sea Museum up in Connecticut, and they said,
now, Tom, let me ask you, just to keep up with the time.
Yeah.
Saturday we're talking about 1805 or 1803, because VC won the lotto, I think, in 1799, right?
Yeah, the uprising was 1822.
Oh, 1822. Okay.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And when it failed, and of course, Saturday had his list on the name of conspirators. They were rounding them up, the Charleston authorities. And that's when Philip got him out of town, even killed a slave patrolman who was going to arrest Saturday on their way to Georgetown.
Really?
And they took ship together from Georgetown to Cuba. And in Cuba, my uncle, that's John Chartrand, the other boy in the escape, had a plantation, and they offered to pay for his freedom, but he said, no, I have the money to pay for my freedom. See, in Cuba, you could buy your freedom.
Right.
And so you have to go through a whole process, but he did buy it. And that's where he was reunited with Richmond, was in Cuba.
Okay. Now, how far is Wenchville from Beaufort?
How far is what from Beaufort?
Wenchville from Beaufort. If you're in Wenchville, you want to go to Beaufort, South Carolina. How far is that? Is it about 20-some miles away?
Richville, to be honest, I'm not familiar with where Richville actually is. I know where Beaufort is.
Right.
Because I've spent a lot of time there.
Okay.
But there are a lot of little coastal towns,
right,
that are relatively close. And,
because the reason I'm saying that, because you mentioned the Low Country, and in the book of Denmark Vesey, he went all the way down to Beaufort, which is 60 miles away from Charleston, to mobilize slaves. And that very night, they were supposed to go on to escape to Haiti. Yeah. So Saturday arrived in Cuba. So what happened when he
arrived in Cuba? Well, he first of all he bought his freedom.
Right.
His boys, John and Philip.
Right.
By the way, in talking about those two,
right,
I already mentioned that Philip owned slaves.
Right.
He bought slaves to provide cheap labor for his garden there in Charleston.
In Charleston.
And he acknowledged very early that he had made a mistake. His closest friend was William Penn Basson, who was a true Quaker in one regard, and that is he was very much anti-slavery. And he kept working on Philip to free his slaves.
Right.
And then there's John, who was a more hardened slave owner. He went to sea as a 14-year-old,
right,
as a slave trader, and then eventually he gave that up, but he had a plantation there in Cuba, near I was trying to think of the little town that's right there next to it. Oh, gee, it's funny how things fly out of your mind.
That's okay. That's okay. So
yeah. Anyway, the little town is really significant because there's a huge slave museum there. It's in Matanzas.
Is that Georgetown?
Huh?
Georgetown?
No, it's in Matanzas, Cuba, in the province.
In Matanzas, Cuba. Okay.
And it's Limonar. I knew I'd think of it. Think of Limonar. A-U-R. Limonar. Limonar was right next to John's plantation, and it became I hate to use the term, but it was a sort of dumping ground for slaves who were too old to work anymore, or who were injured. Sometimes the slaves recently freed would go to Limonar. Okay. And Saturday, part of his being in Cuba was to find Witch Woman, which he finally did. She worked for John, and she was very standoffish because they'd been separated for 30 years. Their hot romance began in Saint Domingue, and was interrupted because Uncle Philip took her to Cuba and gave Saturday traveling money to Charleston. And let me tell you, Saturday was a very forgiving person, but he never forgave Uncle Philip for that. because he felt like it was intentional. And
now let me ask you something. So in the end, actually, Philip gave up the slave and freed them all.
no, he died a slave owner, died in 1857. But
Right.
remember, at that time, South Carolina law completely took ownership out of his hands and put it in the hands of the state, saying the only way you could leave the state would be as a free black, because they were trying to get rid of the free blacks.
Right.
But he did acknowledge in his own way in 1850 that he believed that his father was Saturday. And certainly if anybody knew Saturday and the wonderful man that he was,
Right.
they wanted him as their father anyway. You know, he was the father of the heart. And but getting back to Cuba, they faced all kinds of slave rebellions and uprisings there. And in the Escalero conspiracy,
Right.
the Spanish government really came down hard
Right.
on free blacks, especially.
Right.
And so Saturday became the sort of, you might say, senior citizen and mayor of
Right.
Lehman Bar.
Right.
He and a Catholic priest by the name of Father Rangel saw to the education, literacy, first of all, of the people there. Saturday once said, to see a child become literate is very moving, but to see that happen with an adult is spiritual. And and so Saturday became the mentor of that community, and they weathered the Escalera conspiracy barely.
Right.
But in the end, which woman had to leave and go into slavery to save her life. That was the only option, to go back to South Carolina or go to South Carolina.
Okay, so that aspect on the other aspect on Saturday's life that I would like to ask you, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in your research, did you find any clue that will lead you to some understanding of how Saturday had managed to speak so many languages?
Well, of course, the seven were the language of the Aradas, Yoruba, which was the language of the Lucani. He was a Lucani.
Right.
And then Creole and Gullah, French, Spanish, and English. Now, some of that came from the fact that Aunt Caroline, who was his surrogate mama at Breda,
right,
saved him from the cane fields by bringing him in and teaching him how to wait tables, and then eventually, he became a mainstay of the kitchen. And of course, he picked up the language that way.
Right.
And he was educated by a white manager of Breda, the same man that saw to the education of Tucson. It was Bayon de Libertad. And Bayon de Libertad saw to it that Saturday was given the same advantages that Tucson was, because Tucson insisted on it.
Right.
Tucson became the surrogate father of Saturday in a way, and Saturday adored him. But that's how he became not just literate but educated. He was educated by Jesuit priests.
Okay.
And some of them had fallen a great deal. Tucson was very religious, and he made sure that these Jesuits who had fallen didn't go too far off the track in their cynicism.
But you can be a very educated person, but still not well versed in so many languages. It might have been a set of circumstances that put him in a situation where he had to learn those other languages.
Well, he would have learned English, certainly,
right,
in Charleston.
Right.
He would have learned Spanish in Cuba. He already would need French probably from Saint Domingue.
And Creole.
And then, of course, these other languages.
Right.
And there was kind of a touching language session between Aunt Caroline and Saturday. She would teach him at night the words for Creole and the equivalency, and she was a pretty strict teacher.
Okay. So my last question, and we're getting out of time now. How did you get to really be exposed to the story of Saturday?
Well, it all started when I would go down to Sumter, South Carolina, which is in Low Country, not far from Branson.
Okay.
And stay with Uncle Mac and Aunt Nadine, and usually my dad would go with me.
Right.
And we'd go fishing on Lake Marion, which is one of the largest natural lakes in the country.
Right.
And at night we'd come back with a big string of fish. Well, I hated cleaning fish. And I'd sneak off the front porch. I was a 10-year-old child, about that age. And Aunt Nadine knew my bad habits. And she'd come out and tell me stories about the Ott ancestors and a few French ancestors that connected with the family. One was Catherine Chartrand and Saturday. And that just stayed with me. I forgot most of the other stories she ever told me, but she told me about the night of fire, the escape.
Right.
And that was as far as she could take it. And then as it turned out, I guess you might call it fate, when I went into my Latin American studies with my emphasis on Haiti, kept running in. And of course, I wrote the book on the revolution. The more I got into the story, I found bits and pieces about Saturday.
Right,
It took me 40 years to accumulate the material to write the story.
Okay.
And so gradually, and by the way, I had two big advantages.
Right.
At the very end, my mother was, God bless her, a wonderful woman. But when she died, she left me a chest full of letters.
Okay.
And some of them were about Saturday, and even a few about witch woman. The other thing is, because he was literate, now this is an advantage I had opposed to somebody that's researching a subject where the subject is not literate. Saturday left a written will, and my wife and I found it in Charleston.
Really?
And at the South Carolina Library, which is really the repository in Charleston.
Charleston, okay.
And the will was in the Barbeau papers.
Okay.
And that really gave me a lot of clues about where he had been, people in his life, make the point that he was a devout Catholic, and that he'd never been married.
Okay.
He did sire some children, but never formally married. And
doing your research, have you ever really reached out to some of the Haitian historians?
Well, I didn't talk directly to any that I knew. Of course, I looked at some of the books to get atmosphere. One book I think is very interesting to just sort of get the mood is James Laburn's Haitian People. It's probably the best book ever written in English up to 1941. Unfortunately, he died about that time, and then Sidney Mintz picked up his analysis of Haiti.
Right. What's the name of the author you say again? What's the name of the author who died in 1941?
James Leyburn, Leyburn.
Oh, James. Okay.
And it's a great book. In fact, I used to have it around here all the time. But anyway, I just thoroughly liked that book. And of course, there were different other historians that French historians. Now, the French have a lot of interest in the Haitian Revolution.
Right.
They, for some reason, they had kind of a suicide wish.
No, because the thing is, I think 2 years ago, that's when they celebrated the end of slavery, and Toussaint Louverture was the epicenter of that. There's this huge this professor. He was born on the island of the Pacific, Mauritius Island, where they speak the same Creole that the Haitians, pretty much, that the Haitians speak. And he wrote this book called Black Spartacus Toussaint Louverture. This is the latest version of the biography on Toussaint. Yeah, our conversation really, it falls right on time, because at the time that we're celebrating the end of slavery, and which is to us the most hideous form of human interaction, slavery. So I think that, is there anything that you want to say to a young African American out there, or Afro person out there, who would want, because we're still facing the legacy of slavery, as I understand it. Our society sometimes is divided because of the historical injustices that were committed. Anything that, Tom, you might want to say, to a young person out there regarding the story of Saturday, and also the great, I would say, what has to be done between people across color or origin or ethnicity, so we can make our society better.
Okay, I would say this, that the story of Saturday is a great story of human compassion. Mm-hmm. You have to realize that he was very much in tune with what a person, their character,
right,
rather than their skin color.
Right.
And he saw good and bad people on both sides of the issue. He made a distinction between the actors and the act.
Right.
He condemned the act. Some of the actors deserve to be condemned too, like Del Weevil in the story, the evil plantation master who, manager who got himself killed. But the story is that he had this amazing ability to adjust and not let the compulsion for revenge eat him up.
Hey, so with that, because we're running out of time before Zoom stops us, so it's been such a pleasure, Tom. We wanted to have that conversation for the longest now.
Well, it's pleasure to talk to you.
Yes, and hopefully we'll be able to meet someday up in Alabama. How's that?
Yeah, there's a lot here.
Post-COVID.
We have the WC Handy Festival.
Yes.
All of the blues,
Yes, yes. Most definitely.
Oh, by the way, if anybody wants to buy my book, they can get it on Amazon.
I will do that. I will tell them, and I will post them, and I will do everything.
Okay. Now, if they want a signed copy, which I'd be willing to send them, my email address is thomasott330@yahoo.com.
Okay. I will put all that information for them.
Okay.
All right, Tom.
Okay. Thank you, Ardain.
Yeah, we'll talk soon.
Okay.
Bye.